Hello to you all. Big week for the Seattle Seahawks with free agency getting underway and a lot of big decisions to be made as to the future of this franchise coming up. I feel like we're going to find out a lot of things this week. Rob Staton and Jeff Simmons here to talk about the main topics involving the Seahawks and NFL free agency. But first of all, Jeff, I feel like we should just get this topic out of the way. Let's just discuss it very quickly and move on. Deshaun Watson, yes or no?
I got to say no on that one. If we're just talking from the Seahawks perspective, I get it if you're the Panthers or the Saints. But we just saw the last 3 to 5 years with Seattle where they had a good quarterback. The rest of their roster was left a little thin. They haven't drafted well. Yes, I get why a team would be after Watson. He's the best quarterback, no doubt, that's going to come available this offseason. Now that Aaron Rodgers and Wilson are. But if you're Seattle, you got to trade basically all the capital you got to get him. You got to eat up your entire cap space, basically. And then you're left with arguably a worse situation you were in last year. So even if we just for a second ignore all the off-the-field stuff, because that's a whole other conversation, just purely football, I don't think it makes sense. And if Pete does make that move, it looks like a move that he's doing because that whole thing, he's 70 years old, he doesn't want to rebuild. Instead of doing what's best for the team, to me, that would be a desperate move. I get the idea of getting a younger quarterback, but to me, you don't leave yourself with enough and you just end up, you're that first round fodder team that you were. And what was the point of trading Russell Wilson? Just to end up in the same spot.
Yeah, it's hard to see how the Seahawks do any better than they've done over the last few years with Deshaun Watson simply replacing Russell Wilson. And the problem, Jeff, for me is I think this would split the fan base in a way that even let Russ cook and fire Pete and running backs don't matter could only dream of, really. The Seahawks would become quite a toxic place because there'd be a lot of fans saying, I don't want anything to do with this guy. I'm not going to follow the team anymore. Whether they follow through with that or not, they would say it. And you'd have a whole bunch of people saying, what you're talking about, this is brilliant. You know, they've got a quarterback. And then if the team succeeded, you'd have a lot of I told you so's. And if the team failed, you would have a lot of I told you so's. Why have they gone down this road? To me, the benefits are so minimal. You are basically hoping to bring this guy in and then on somehow, some way, fill various holes on your roster to create a championship team. And it would be an extreme short-term move when I think if we're being really honest with this roster, it needs a lot of work. And unfortunately, that probably means you're going to have to spend a bit of time and a bit of care building this roster and then finding a quarterback, and whether that is through the draft or via a big trade down the line. But to me, Jeff, I don't think you can build a championship contender from essentially ground zero in one offseason. The Seahawks are not in the same place as, let's say, the Denver Broncos are, or some of these other teams who are going to be very, very aggressive here. There's a lot of work to be done. And until that work is done, regardless of all the off-field concerns, which bother me greatly, frankly, because, I mean, my biggest problem, Jeff, is not even any of this. It's what the heck has been going on with Deshaun Watson. And whether these allegations are true or how true they are or whatever, we don't know. I've certainly not studied it enough and investigated it enough to know. And I'm guessing most fans are in the same boat. But there is a little bit of a fear for me, Jeff, that if you trade everything for this guy, what if there's just one more allegation or anything similar to this, either from the past or that occurs in the next 12 months? What happens then? I mean, like, is he going to get suspended? Are you going to have to cut him? Are you going to have to move on? I mean, like, you are taking a huge risk with this guy. And there's a difference between signing him as a free agent and taking a risk and paying him what it would cost if you were going to sign him as a free agent, but also giving away multiple draft picks.
Yeah, you covered most of the points that I was going to make. And you mentioned there might be another incident. He might get suspended without another incident. There's been precedent, Ben Roethlisberger, Ezekiel Elliott, where the criminal cases were withdrawn and they both got 6-game suspensions. So he could still deal with that. The civil cases are still to be dealt with. Yeah, I just think it's such a risky, and you've got to look at where the Seahawks are. I know Pete and John don't really care about PR as much as maybe they should. They've done this with Frank Clark. They came out, they took a bunch of hits. They would probably view that as that worked out really well. But right now, this has to be the worst situation, Pete and Jonathan, just from a PR standpoint. We saw the Russell trade. There's a lot of people who just are still in complete, utter shock that happened. I can't believe that they sided with Pete and John over Russell. And then the Bobby Wagner tweet comes out where that just had to be the worst look for the organization. We don't know their side of the story, and we'll hear from them probably on Wednesday. But right now with the Russell trade, some of the stuff coming out about why Russell and Pete went their separate ways, and then the Bobby tweet to bring in Watson on top of that, man, their approval rating would just tank. And it's just such a risk from an acquisition standpoint, from a fan base standpoint, from a draft capital standpoint. And to be honest, even if you do it and it works out, I don't think you're any better off than you were before, because Russell played, even in the last couple of years, he was a pretty good quarterback before that dip in the end of 2020. So I just see a team that they had a lot of short-term pieces. Like, they got good. You look at their team last year, their best two players on the team last year were probably Quandre Diggs and Tyler Lockett, both very solid players, but they're not, if you're looking at like young building blocks, how do I build my team going forward? Like, who are the core players? If you have Quandre Diggs and Tyler Lockett as your two best players, that is not a good roster. You need building blocks, and whether that's a young quarterback, whether that's a draft pick to build up the offensive line, the defensive line. They're probably 2 years away from being competitive again. And if I were them, I would not be looking at a short term like a Kirk Cousins or Deshaun Watson. To me, that doesn't fit what they need to do. And to me, they have a pretty good opportunity here to get this fixed. And if they go in with the right attitude and not take shortcuts, but we'll see. This week's going to be stressful for a lot of Seahawks fans.
Yeah, it certainly is. Derek has sent a super chat in. Derek, thank you. Really appreciate that. Good stuff. If people want to send those in, please feel free. We're getting a lot of questions in here, but Jeff and I have got a lot to get through. So I think what we'll do is, if you have a question in particular that you want to be asked, then go with the super chat route. Otherwise, we're probably going to cover a lot of what you're asking about over the course of this live stream. So if we're both sort of in agreement that Deshaun Watson should not be the future of the Seattle Seahawks, let's sort of talk a little bit about 2022 in particular. Is Drew Lock the starting quarterback now? They've included him as part of this deal. You could look at it two ways. You could say, well, of course they have, it's just a cheap quarterback that they can acquire. If you actually run down the list of available veteran quarterbacks, many of them are very mediocre. So why not have Drew Lock on board at a minimal price and throw him into the competition? There are other people suggesting, I've seen this a couple of times now, that John Schneider was a big fan of Drew Lock going into the draft. I actually had a look at Drew Lock's draft profile from the year that he came out, because Lance Zierlein's been doing these draft grades for a long time now, Jeff, and his grade system is the same. And the grade that he had on Drew Lock was a 6.40, which is actually the same grade that he's given people like Kenny Pickett and Malik Willis and Matt Corral. So he's saying essentially that Drew Lock going into the league had the same kind of grade as the guys that are going into the league now. How do you think the Seahawks are going to use Drew Lock in, and what are the chances of week one the offense comes out onto the field and Drew Lock is leading the way?
I think that there's going to be a lot of spin over the next week from John Schneider and the Seahawks about Drew Lock. I think we saw today the Jeremy Fowler article came out that Rob referenced on Twitter, which is he talked about the Watson side, but in that article it said that the Seahawks are higher than other people on Lock and they view him as a potential fallback plan to start week one. I don't buy that at all. I think that's bullshit. I think Lock to them is a potential option of a stopgap. For when I was understood, they have a number of stopgap options, which is one of their quarterback scenarios that they have multiple scenarios that they're looking at. I think there's a possibility that if they decide, okay, either the quarterback we want in the draft isn't going to fall to us, or we like quarterbacks next year and we want to build up, then to me, Lock could be in a competition with a number of stopgap veteran quarterbacks. We've talked about some of them already. Maybe that's Tyrod Taylor. Maybe that's Teddy Bridgewater. Maybe that's someone like that. where I think that's really the only scenario where you might get a Drew Lock as the week 1 starter. And I think they view him, and I think it would be a fine way to view him, as they view him as a potential guy. If they're not really worried about this season, throw him out there, see if he's got anything. And if not, his contract's up after next year, you walk away. To me, that makes sense. And there's no risk to it. He's an upside flyer. But I think we're going to learn a lot about. I think the thing with this team right now, and I don't think I've said this before, I don't think a lot of people have a clue what they're going to do. I think you have to see how they use this cap room the next week to give us an idea of what their plan is. Because there's been talk of Kirk Cousins. There's been talk of Watson. There's been a lot of buzz around the league, and some people I've talked to, and about Malik Willis. Matt Miller tweeted it out too. He heard it at the combine. You mentioned Daniel Jeremiah thought all the people in the league thought it was Watson all the way. So I think my answer to that is I think Locke, there's a scenario for him. But anyone who's selling this idea that they think he's like a low-risk guy they can try to buy low on and fix, that's PR spin. That's what they do. They want fans to be excited. But I think Seahawks fans have gone pretty smart. It's a really intelligent fan base. I don't think they will buy it. And I think it's going to make some people really nervous, or some people are just going to roll their eyes.
I must admit, there's a little bit of anxiety, sort of football anxiety, not serious anxiety about what is going to happen when the legal tampering window opens. I remember in 2011, they very quickly signed Tavares Jackson. And, you thought, okay, fair enough, they've signed Tavares Jackson. Nobody thought they've signed Tavares Jackson. This is the future of the Seattle Seahawks. Everybody could see that it was a lockout year. They brought somebody in who was familiar with the offensive coordinator they'd already appointed in Darrell Bevel. They then went and signed Sidney Rice, who'd been playing with Jackson in Minnesota. So it all kind of made sense. And I'm wondering what they're going to do here, because for me, there is sort of various scenarios. We might find out in the next 24 hours that they've made a trade for someone like Kirk Cousins. I think it's pretty well established that Carroll, he really liked Kirk Cousins. They spent a lot of time together before the 2012 draft. There was a bit of talk that Cousins was furious that the Seahawks took Russell Wilson instead of him, because he was fully expecting to be drafted by Seattle. There's also been talk that Seattle would have drafted Cousins if Wilson wasn't there. So that could happen, but then he's very expensive. There's not going to be any, Kirk, can you just shave $15 million off your cap hit this year by extending for a couple more years? He'll say, yeah, but give me $45 million a year for the next 2 years. So he is, I think Florio described him as the GOAT of contract negotiations over the years. I mean, the guy has made more money than probably any other player in the NFL and has achieved very little in the process. So that to me is, on paper, it sounds plausible until you actually think about the financial side of it. So but that is an option. And then the other option is they don't do anything and Drew Lock emerges as more of a viable starter than maybe we all thought initially, or they go and sign somebody else. And this is kind of the thing that I would like them to do, Jeff, because I think if they do this, it answers the question. It removes the mystery. And that is just going and getting someone like Tyrod Taylor. Because then once you've signed Tyrod Taylor for, let's say, he was on a deal worth $5.5 million in Houston last year. If you get him for $3, $4, $5 million, you've got a couple of guys, three guys, Eason, Taylor, and Locke as your competition. You've answered that question. It's unlikely then that you're going to go and make any kind of move for anybody else. We know we've got clarity on the position. We can all kind of breathe a sigh of relief that they are sort of embracing this as a build. That, to me, would be the best case scenario. Not for the long-term success. No one's saying that Tyrod Taylor and Drew Lock are going to be in Seattle maybe more than a year. But in terms of my preference, and it sounds like your preference as well, that is what I would prefer them to do.
Yeah, I think they have to be honest with themselves. And this is where it gets a little worrisome, where you wonder who's driving the decisions here. Is it Pete, who's 7 years old and probably doesn't know if he wants to go through the cycle again like 2011? I think 2011, what we just talked about, is a great model for what this team should be looking at. I would not make a splashy move at quarterback. And if that means Drew Lock, who I've bashed on Twitter, on here, that means he plays a little bit this year, or Tyrod Taylor, to me, that's logical. Spend this year, punt the year at quarterback, and try to fix the rest of your team. Because if you really like this draft class next year, and we've talked some of the big names in the league, I know, Rob, you have a guy you really like. If you get one of those guys next year, and you use the capital this year to fix the rest of your team, that puts you in a spot similar to what we saw in Seattle in 2012, where you put you pair the rookie quarterback who's on his cheap contract with a really good young roster. To me, that can be done in 2 years. And to me, if you're being honest with yourselves and you're not taking shortcuts and you realize what this team needs, I wouldn't sign a Quandre Diggs at 31 years old, or I wouldn't sign Dwayne Brown. I would focus my whole offseason on getting younger players. This year, maybe you don't look at the quarterback, and if you suck this year, that's okay. If you're trying to get maybe like a pass rusher at number 9 and spend free agency on young players, to me, that's so much more logical than a shortcut with a Kirk Cousins or even like a Marcus Mariota. I would be okay with something like that. Take a 1-year flyer on the guy, have him compete with Drew Lock, spend all your resources on fixing the team.
Yeah, and I think also that when we sort of think back to that 2010, 2011, 2012 period, they took some shots. Charlie Whitehurst was far too expensive as a trade.
Yeah.
It got to 2011, and many reports suggested that John Schneider was very keen on Andy Dalton, but Carroll said no, not good enough. And then they waited for Wilson, took him in round 3, liked the upside potential there, added him to the competition, and the rest is history. I would like to see them have that similar kind of patience now, Jeff, because ultimately, yes, I understand that Pete Carroll is 70 years old and is in a rush, but the Seahawks do not exist purely for Pete Carroll. Pete Carroll has a responsibility to this fan base and this franchise to leave it in the best possible shape, not to basically run this as a vanity project and spend all the resources, make short-term moves, hope for the best over the next 2 or 3 years, and then if it doesn't work, just sort of sail off into the sunset and go, good luck, guys, with the rest of the future. He has to, I think it's best for him to sort of build a foundation, create the team. If he doesn't win a Super Bowl before he retires, at least he might be passing the baton to somebody else who can take you to the next level. And we've often seen it with other teams that a coach or a GM or have come together and they've built something. It maybe just needs finishing off. A new pair of eyes comes in, a new coach, and they get the team over the line. So I suspect that Carroll will be viewing it that way. I think that I think a little bit to what Daniel Jeremiah was saying. All my buddies in the league think the Seahawks are going to do this. I think it's because it's that instant reaction. It's Carroll's 70. He's not going to be rebuilding the team. He's not going to be doing this. Of course, I'm certain they're going to go after Deshaun Watson. And if 5 people say that, of course, Daniel Jeremiah is going to go and say on his podcast that he thinks they're going to do this. And the other thing to remember with this is Bill Belichick is the same age as Pete Carroll. And what's he done in the last 2 years? Exactly. He had a bridge year where he had Cam Newton as his quarterback. And then he spent a fortune in free agency last year, 12 months ago. And then they drafted Mac Jones. Now, Pete Carroll could easily have looked at what Belichick did and said, I'll do that. We'll have a bridge quarterback. We'll reset for a year. Next year, we'll spend big because we're going to have $120 million at the moment to spend in free agency. That will come down because you're going to sign players in the next couple of weeks. But at the moment, you've got $120 million, and then we'll draft a quarterback. And I'm not going to mention him again in this stream because I'm going to become his number 1 fan at this rate, and I don't want to be waving the pom-poms too much for him. But Will Levis at Kentucky is the quarterback that I will be targeting. And I think he's going to go very early in round 1. You might have to trade up, but you've got the stock to do that. And if in a year's time, you've spent a bit in free agency, you've drafted well this year, you're in a position to go and get your quarterback, he'll be cheap for 4 or 5 years. That is the platform to success. It is not making a big trade now, trying to go all in. I mean, if you trade for Deshaun Watson now, I think you'll have something like $4 million of cap space for this year. Yeah. How the heck are you going to build a roster? I mean, at the moment, they don't have a left tackle, a right tackle, a center, 2 cornerbacks down, a free safety down. They've just cut Bobby Wagner and Rashard Penny's out of contract, not to mention all of the depth players that you're going to lose. And if you give away all of your draft stock and all of your cap space this year, how are you going to address those things? And this is the thing. People don't want to hear this. They just think, it'd be fine. Somebody's already posted in the comments here. Just bring in Watson, re-sign Dwayne Brown, bring in Kelly, the center from Tampa Bay, sign Jadeveon. I'm like, with what money? You don't just get to do all this stuff. I mean, I know you can work with a cap, but there's working with a cap and there's, giving Jadeveon Clowney a $1 million cap hit to get him under the thing this year, maybe a $30 million cap hit next year. I mean, we have to be realistic here. A couple of super chats have come in from Louis. Nothing on that one, but on this one here, it says if Carolina gets Watson, John Schneider would jump on Darnold. I don't think so after last year, personally. I don't. And he's for $18 million, he definitely isn't.
Yeah.
I want to talk about my approach to free agency, Jeff, and just see if you agree with this. So I've sort of set some rules that I want the Seahawks to run by. The approach to free agency, according to me, 1, reinforce the trenches as a priority.
Yes.
2, create a physical, intimidating defense. 3, invest in players at the right age, not aging players. That's what I want them to do. If they do that, then I'll be happy. And what to avoid? 1, reaching for a quarterback or overpaying for a quarterback, either in cap space or the draft. And 2, trading or signing older players. I think if the Seahawks stick to that, regardless of what the record is this year, I'll be satisfied.
Yeah, and you nailed how I would approach it. I think there are clear areas where they need to adjust. And really the whole offseason, I thought this year was like the last stand with Wilson, and we were going to see different kinds of players. Like a Chandler Jones, to me, would have made a ton of sense. And honestly, from what I'm hearing, I would not be surprised if Chandler Jones ends up in Denver. So that might upset some Seahawks fans. But to me, back to the Seahawks for a second, I think you need to adjust what your plans are. And I think that Sidney Rice 2011 year, Zach Miller is a great way of doing it. And I think you should be you have close to 50 million. I think it dropped a little bit. They extended Phil Haynes or something. But this year, I would not looking at guys who are over 30. I don't see the value in that. You want to buy guys coming off their rookie contract, either undervalued or you're buying at the right time that you can take a shot on, and they're going to be with you for this whole building process. So for me, it's about speed, it's about physical nature, and it's about age more than anything else. So someone like Stephon Gilmore, he's 32 years old. He used to be the best cornerback in the NFL as of 2 years ago. If Russell's still the quarterback, someone like him would make a ton of sense. They got a window. Pete Carroll's got the window. Now, I think if the Seahawks sign him, that would be stupid. And I think that would be a disastrous idea. So I want to look at guys 25, 26, 24, 27 years old, guys who are ascending players. And if you have to pay them, that's fine. You have the room, because if you're going with a rookie quarterback for this next stretch, this allows you to do what you do. They got $50 million in cap room. So you can pay someone like DJ Reed if you want. It's not going to crush you. If you want to go after Carlton Davis, who's one of the top quarterbacks in the league, guys like that don't often come available. I'm on board with that. But I wouldn't sign like a Honey Badger or a guy like that. You want guys who are ascending, they're young, defensive linemen. Often don't sign linebackers. That's a big thing for me. There's the great linebacking core in the middle of this draft. Don't sign linebackers. Sign a center. Sign something like that. Sign sustainable positions that are going to age well. Don't sign a 30-year-old receiver. Go after positions that are ascending talent. Pass rush. I wouldn't be surprised if they're in on Hassan Reddick. I don't know your thoughts on him, but I would not. If they don't love like a Jermaine Johnson, that could be a sign of that. But yeah, second contract guys, young, spend wisely. Don't spend on older players.
On Reddick, I really like Hassan Reddick. Unfortunately, though, a lot of people keep mentioning him, and I've almost kind of like taken up a position of being against him, because I just think a 6'1", 235-pound edge rusher who is 28 years old this year, I just think there's limited sort of mileage there with him. And personally, I'm just enthralled by the idea of taking one of these. And look, Jermaine Johnson would be my preference because of, I think it's his attitude as well as what he's shown. And I think he's a complete edge rusher. I don't think, I think David Ajabo, you could sort of pick holes in his game. You could say there's a lot to like, but there's also, he's somebody who, 2 or 3 years down the line, he might start playing his best football. Whereas I think Jermaine Johnson as a rookie could have a big impact. And I think Kayvon Thibodeau is just so talented that if he falls because of his character, and let's say Jermaine Johnson goes ahead of him in this scenario, then I would be interested in him as well. And I'd be open to any of the three, and I'd be open, if they're all three of them have gone, then I'd be open to trading down. I think we'll see this week. I mean, if they signed a Reddick or a Chandler Jones or somebody like that, then that would be a tell of they're going to do something very different at number 9. And if they don't sign that edge rusher, it's a huge tell that they are going to take a pass rusher. And part of me does, and look, you can go very deep into this, Jeff, and trying to second guess what they're doing here. But there has been at least a little thought in my mind that all this tying themselves to Deshaun Watson is an attempt to show desperation in the quarterback situation. And maybe the Malik Willis talk is that as well, because they want it to not be so obvious that they're going to go for a pass rusher at 9. They want people to believe, we want Willis, we need a quarterback, we're going to go for one at number 9. And what they really want is somebody like Jermaine Johnson. And I just think if you are rebuilding, and look, Clint Hurts will do at the cat out of the bag by saying they need a game wrecker. And, Pete Carroll's been saying they need another Darrell Taylor. So I think if Chandler Jones or somebody doesn't sign next week, then Jermaine Johnson 9 slightly. To go back to free agency, I mean, I've got an idea of what I would like to see, Jeff. And maybe this is too obvious. Maybe this is just, it's not exciting enough for a lot of people, or maybe it's like I say, it's just a bit too obvious. But you make Shane Waldron and Andy Dickerson your 2 main guys on offense, and you say we're going to get rid of Mike Solari and you're going to take on the blocking scheme. And you look and you see the LA Rams have got the number 1 pass protecting unit according to ESPN in the entire NFL. So you're going to have the Rams scheme, I would imagine, and you want to mimic what the Rams have done. Why wouldn't you sign the Rams players who are available? You would weaken one of your division rivals, and you have the cap space that if you wanted to overpay some of these guys, I'd be fine with that. Like, if they spend the 3 names that stand out who are free agents are Joseph Noteboom, who was their tackle who filled in when Whitworth was injured at left tackle and graded very well. There's Brian Allen, the center, who's a bit of a one-year wonder but played very well last year. And there's Austin Corbett, who they brought in from Cleveland on the cheap, who was their guard, who has done pretty well for them. Now, if you told me that they signed all 3 of those players and they paid a little bit more than people were expecting, and people were complaining about it on Twitter, I would not be complaining about it, Jeff, because I think if you weaken them and you bring guys in who know your scheme and they've got chemistry already, because that's a big thing with offensive lines, it's knowing what the guy next to you is going to be doing. I am happy with that. And then guess what? You've got a young offensive line signed up for 3 or 4 or 5 years who you can grow with, who you can build with. And I have no issue taking a chance on a Noteboom at left tackle, an Allen at center, and a Corbett at guard. You can trade Gabe Jackson after June the 1st for a 7th round pick if you want and save $6 million and replace him with Austin Corbett. I'm down for that. I mean, is that too obvious to go down the Rams route, or does that sound like a plan?
Well, I'd say some of it's pretty obvious. And they did it with Gerald Everett last year. And so if we had this conversation this time last year, I would have said Gerald Everett is the tight end they're going to go after. And Everett, that would have been too obvious. And I think day 3 of free agency to sign Gerald Everett because they need guys to implement the Shane Waldron system. I thought Austin Blythe, who was their center last year, was going to be a target of theirs, but they went back with Eason Posick, who actually played pretty well. And I'm a little fearful that Andy Dickerson might see that they've kind of had no names at center the way the Rams have gone out and how they've developed players. It was Blythe, and then it was John Sullivan off the street. But to me, if I'm the Seahawks, I'm telling you right now, like one of the guys I'm eyeing is Joseph Noteboom. I do not think Dwayne Brown is probably going to re-sign back here, given that Russell's not back here. He probably sees a team he's 37 years old. He probably doesn't want to play for a team that has an uncertain future. I see him probably going to the Colts. Noteboom's a guy who I think they could go at left tackle. I see him. I'm looking at it, unless they think someone can fall in the draft. I think Noteboom and Allen are 2 guys that make a ton of sense. Corbett, I'd say, is probably the least likely of the 3 because they did pay Gabe Jackson last year. I would probably move on from him if I'm the Seahawks, given where the team is right now. I would not want that much invested in a mediocre right guard. But they have Damian Lewis. They paid Phil Haynes a decent bump up. He played really well last year at the end of the year. I don't know if you can count on that over a full season, but they have numbers at guard. I think the left tackle and center are far more likely than them investing in Austin Corbett. But I think all 3 would make a ton of sense. If they signed any of them, there's a lot of logic there. But we just haven't seen the team invest in free agent centers. The way they've handled that position has been absolute disaster. And they had a couple of years of Justin Brand, and they convinced themselves he was pretty good when he was just so much better than the crap they had before. And the way they've just whiffed on this position, really since Max Ungar's been there. So that was 7 seasons ago. It's one of the reasons that I think this front office should have been let go a long time ago. But they need to fix this spot, especially if they're going to bring in a new quarterback. Bring in a veteran center. That's a great way to transition a young quarterback. Don't keep cheaping out on Ethan Posick and getting at best average play. To me, that's a way to just set yourself up for more failure.
The strangest thing that they ever did at centre was drafting Ethan Posick, who was a pure centre at LSU in round 2. And then, and assuming when that happened, while they're preparing for life after Justin Britt, whose contract's expiring at the end of this season. But then after the draft, paying Justin Britt an absolute fortune to be the long-term centre. And then having to shoehorn Posick in at right tackle during training camp or shifting him to guard or whatever, and it not working. And then just sort of having this random second-round pick on the roster and then constantly talking up, well, he can play multiple positions. Well, no, he can't. And then him not starting at any of them because he wasn't good enough. And then right at the end of his career, sort of going, well, go on then, we'll give you a go at centre. I mean, it was just so bizarre. And then you've sort of got that investment, the second rounder and the Justin Britt money, a complete contrast to what they've done since, which is just ignore the position. So you kind of think, well, on the one hand, they're never going to invest in this position. It's always going to be some random dude who's just playing centre. But then you say, well, no, but they have invested in the position, but in the most ridiculous way. So just go and get, and look, the thing about Noteboom, Allen and Corbett, I think I'm right in saying they're all 26. So a rebuild doesn't have to just be through the draft. And you mentioned it, Sidney Rice and Zach Miller were both a good age when they signed them. If you go and bring in guys who are sort of in that 25 to 28 age range, then yes, you're not going to be competing right away, but you can build with them. And the other thing about Noteboom, Allen and Corbett is they haven't got that internal pressure of, I better go somewhere where I can win a ring, because they've just won one. So they might be thinking, what's most important to me right now is to cash in, because I've won a Super Bowl. Now I want to set up my family for the rest of my life. So, and oh, look, here's the Seahawks rolling into town with their $50 million of cap space and $120 million of cap space next year, which, if you don't use it, it doesn't get you 3 extra points in a game. You better use that cap space. And I don't see why they shouldn't. And I hope that they target these younger guys. And look, if Noteboom comes in and he's a disaster and you have to, and you kind of out again, you can criticize the team when they do stupid things that don't work. I think when you can't criticize the team when they make the right moves and they just don't play out. And this will be one of those instances where I think you give them the chance to go and sign these guys. And if they do it and it doesn't work, well, that's life. Sometimes that happens. The other free agent moves that I would like to see, Jeff, because I want to see them sort of target players of the right age. I want to see them bring back DJ Reed. He's in his mid-20s. I think that would be a good signing because he knows the system, he knows the team, and I think he played well enough. I'd be open to Sidney Jones coming back. I've no issue with that. I think now that you've got the money to spend, I've got no issue whatsoever bringing Rashad Penny back on a 1-year deal and just giving him a chance to see if he can build off what he did last season on a prove-it deal for 1 more year. And I'm interested by this report from Jeremy Fowler that they were digging around the wide receiver market, because I really like the idea of them going out and getting a third receiver. I think that was probably more like we quite like the idea of it rather than it's going to lead to sort of Christian Kirk coming to Seattle, because you would imagine that they're already saying that he's going to have a huge market and that teams like Detroit are going to throw money at him. So I can't imagine him landing in Seattle. But maybe in the second week of free agency, Jeff, there's still a few guys available who are willing to come and play on a prove-it deal. I'm not sure why they'd pick the Seahawks with no quarterback, but you never know. I mean, it's sometimes strange things happen. That's how I think they will approach it. But that's all very modest and realistic, because I'm not suggesting they go out there and, I'm sure there'll be other. I bet if you just type in Seahawks free agency in YouTube, there's all sorts of weird and wonderful videos on there right now. People saying they should do this and they should sign this guy. I think sort of the plan that we've got here is pretty modest, but also makes some sense of where the Seahawks are.
And yeah, that's what they should do. They have the flexibility now to really target guys they want. As you said, I think wide receiver will be a harder sell. And I think it was very logical they traded for a tight end instead of having to sign one. I think that would have been a much harder sell for the same reason. So I think they might sign a backup tight end, like a Will Dissly if he comes back. That would not be surprising. But yeah, I think there is some room to get a little aggressive with certain guys. And I think the offensive line is the perfect spot for it. I think that's a place where you can now spend. And even if you do want to spend a third position, now that you've cleared out quarterback salaries for the next few years, and say they do draft a rookie quarterback in the next 2 years, you can now invest a lot of money elsewhere. Where we saw them they do luxurious things with Percy Harvin a couple of years back that did not work out. That would have been better just to spend in free agency. But they now will have the luxury of the next 5 years, maybe 6 years, depending on when they draft their quarterback, that they can now spend on luxury positions, and they can now spend in free agency and be a little more aggressive, because going from a 35, and Russell was about to get a $50 million contract. It wasn't going to be here, but that's what would have happened if he was happy with things. Or say they fired Pete Carroll and they brought a new general manager, they were going to, and they say they were really tied to Russell, they would have signed him to a $50 million contract. So the whole makeup of your roster, and why I'm excited about the potential of rebuilding, is now you can be really aggressive and really selective with free agency, and you don't have to be that. If Russell came back, this free agency would have been a very stressful time for Seahawks fans. If they whiffed on some of the bigger names, talk and the mood of the team, now it's the fun building part. So to me, I'm just looking at young players that you can spend some money on in important positions. I think Carlton Davis is a guy I'd be willing to take a flyer on. He's played pretty well. You always ask, why is he getting a free agency? Why? Because they had to pay Chris Godwin. They have not been able to figure that out. So he's a guy that doesn't usually hit free agency. So getting a number one cornerback and you pair him with Trey Brown for the next little while, to me, that'd be pretty good. But I love the idea of spending on sustainably good positions like the offensive line. Do not spend on linebackers. I wouldn't spend huge on another safety. Put in young guys who can run around, and I would not. I saw today that they're probably going to sign Quandre Diggs. I don't think I would. I think he'd be better off going to play for a team that's contending for a championship in this window, because he's a really good player. I really like Quandre. He might have been my favorite Seahawks last year, but I would not sign him if I were trying to rebuild the roster.
Yeah, the Quandre Diggs one is what I've thought about quite a lot, because I suppose on the one hand, if you bring him back, you don't have to replace him. And I think you do have to replace him if he moves on some way, in the draft. And look, and I'm a big fan of Maryland's Nick Cross, and he is a headhunter, but he ran a 4.34 at the combine. So you think, well, okay, he can maybe be he can cover a lot of ground as well with that kind of speed. So I think that he's somebody you could potentially look at there. But if you keep Quandre Diggs, you can look at a different position maybe in the draft. So, it's give and take, really. I think it's how much Quandre Diggs is going to cost coming off an injury. And if the price is right, then no issue with it. If the price goes to a certain point, I would move on. And the priority should be the trenches and sort of rebuilding that O-line. And I think if you rebuild the O-line, you can set yourself up, because this is a terrific defensive draft. And I want to talk about the draft, Jeff. We've touched on it a little bit. Jermaine Johnson is the guy that I want. I think if you bring in Jermaine Johnson, now I'm not saying for a second that Jermaine Johnson and Darrell Taylor are Cam Chancellor and Marshawn Lynch, but I think as two individuals, they give you a chance to represent the heart and soul of a team. And the one thing the Seahawks had back in the day is they had a couple of guys in Cam and Marshawn who just connected everything together. And I think that you have a chance with these two guys to be your identity. For the Seahawks to be known as, wow, they've got those two crazy pass rushers flying off the edge, giving teams a headache, and you've got two of the best young pass rushers in the NFL. That's an identity. It's a pathway forward. The San Francisco 49ers have been to a Super Bowl and an NFC Championship game off the back of having a fantastic defensive line. And it's covered a lot of warts because they could run the ball, and they had Nick Bosa and Eric Armstead and DeForest Buckner and G Ford and people like that. It doesn't matter that they've got Jimmy Garoppolo at quarterback. I'm not saying that I want the Seahawks to have a Jimmy G level quarterback for years and years, but I'm just saying that it can be the infrastructure and the foundation of a successful team. So go and do that. I don't want them to consider anything else, Jeff, at number 9. I want them to address O-line next week, and I want them to draft the pass rusher at number 9. Whether it is, and if it isn't Jermaine Johnson, I am very comfortable taking Thibodeau, and I would consider David Ojabo. I think he's more of a project, though, as we've discussed, with that pick. And then I think you build from there. And then in round 2, I'm looking at Channing Tindall. I'm looking at Leo Chanel. I would consider Josh Pichel, Brian Cook, Nick Cross, as other defensive players. I'd seriously consider trading back into the first if I needed to get at one of these defensive tackles. Although I wonder if Shelby Harris coming in has maybe pushed that to the side slightly. But if you get a shot at Jordan Davis, Devontae Wyatt, Travis Jones, and Perrion Winfrey by moving back into the late first, I'd consider it at least. And then the other thing is if, we've talked about Noteboom who's a left tackle, Allen who's a centre, and I've talked about Corbett who's a guard. If you haven't addressed right tackle, and if Abraham Lucas is destined to still be there at 41, 42 or whatever, where they're picking, I would love to say, okay, you're going to take a couple of defensive players first, Jeff, linebacker, a pass rusher, and then take Abraham Lucas with one of those other picks as your long-term right tackle. I think that with the free agency moves, you ain't going to be winning many games in 2022, I don't think. But I think you could potentially be a really, really good team for 4 to 5 years after.
And yeah, I'm just taking this back a step further. If you had heard me on my podcast during the playoffs, the one thing I talked about, and I know you've talked about this a lot, is there's a lot of narratives about Matt Stafford and sort of Joe Burrow. But if you really watch the playoffs closely this year, Joe Burrow won a couple games throwing one touchdown pass. So if you watch the playoffs closely, it was the blue chip defensive linemen that dominated almost every game. And even in the game like the Tennessee Titans lost, Jeffrey Simmons, same name as me. And you lost the game the Packers lost to the Niners. It was Bosa, it was Armstead, and even from the Packers side, they held San Francisco to no touchdowns in the second half. It was Rashawn Gary and guys like that. And in the Super Bowl, why did they win? It was Von Miller and Aaron Donald. Players that win the playoff games, and it's really we all this talk about, the team's held back Russell, all this stuff. Who have they had on defense has been that blue chip player to take over a playoff game? It hasn't been there. And you look at their team, it's Darrell Taylor, Jamal Adams, and last year it was Bobby Wagner. And I thought that was the reason they had to walk away from Bobby Wagner, as shitty as that was for accepting a lot of us, because paying $20 or $15 million for a linebacker isn't what wins in the playoffs. You look at the playoffs. It was Logan Wilson running around the field, and it was this defensive lineman. Trey Hendrickson was awesome for Cincinnati this year. So the Seahawks, if they take a pass rusher at 9 or invest in one in the free agency, but they need those blue chip defensive linemen. That's how. And when they won the Super Bowl, they had Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill. You're not going to find guys like that for under $10 million anymore. That was a fluke. That was an outlier. And the Seahawks have done well finding that in free agency, which is why, to me, the exciting part of that Russell Wilson trade, as much as it left the franchise with a ton of uncertainty, and who knows if they got enough for him, whatever, the chance to get one of those pass rushers, to me, fired me up, because you look at what's just been missing on this team. And the thing that's bothered me the most about John Schneider, and I don't know, Pete, whoever decides this, if they've just been going year to year with, to me, a spot that's really important. And they went from having Frank Clark to Clowney to they had to trade for Dunlap. They had that bad Mayola and Irvin plan. And to me, it's a spot that you talk about pass rushers, coverage, all that nonsense. The pass rush is winning in all of these playoff games. They dominated almost every single one. And to me, to pair Taylor with, say, Jermaine Johnson, if that's the guy and he hits and he plays like a top 10 pick, that's setting you up with a totally different look on defense. 2 young players you're going to have under rookie contracts. If that's the core of your team and your defense, it's a lot easier to build. Because you said San Francisco went to the Super Bowl. They should have made the Super Bowl this year. And Jimmy G was awful in the playoffs. Awful. And when you have young defensive linemen, those guys are called game wreckers for a reason, because they can ruin your offense. They held Green Bay to 10 points in the playoffs. They didn't have a good coverage unit. They had a great defensive line, fast linebackers, and below average secondary. And they were one dropped interception away from going to the Super Bowl. They probably would have won the Super Bowl this year, the San Francisco Niners. So they could have won 2 Super Bowls in the last 3 years with Jimmy freaking Garoppolo. So to me, if you can rebuild this pass rush with young guys on the defensive line and have core players in that spot, because they really haven't. They've been trading for guys year after year after year. To me, that's so important to the next phase of this organization, because really just haven't done a good enough job. They've been scotch taping that position together. To me, it's far too important to do that.
You have just stumbled across the single greatest point of this offseason. That's it. That's the Seahawks offseason in a nutshell. Everything that you've just said there, that's what has to be. You might as well just sort of sum that up in a sentence, put it up in the draft room, because you're absolutely right. And we all, and everybody does it in the NFL, obsesses about quarterbacks. If Jaquiski Tartt could catch a cold, the San Francisco 49ers would have been in the Super Bowl. if Jimmy Garoppolo could complete a first down in the fourth quarter against Kansas City, they would have been in the Super Bowl. I mean, we're talking about a play in both games is the difference potentially between San Francisco winning both of those huge games. And they did it off the back of their pass rush, and the playoffs and everything that you've said is absolutely correct. And even in the Super Bowl, like it was Aaron Donald, wasn't it? And it was the pass rush ultimately that prevented Cincinnati from getting a late drive at the end. You've got to have pass rush. And you talking that way, Jeff, made me, because I've not really thought of it into those extreme terms. But if you are in the league, you must have noticed that. So I suppose it's on the two hands. One, I actually feel more confident now that the Seahawks are going to go down the road that I hope they go down, because they can't ignore what's happening in the league. But also, I wonder a little bit whether or not the pass rushers are going to come off the board very quickly in a top 10 where there's not, I mean, I've put together a mock draft which will come out. I'm just going to wait to see how free agency begins tomorrow, where I think there's still a distinct possibility that Thibodeau and Hutchinson go 1 and 2. And then, you've got a handful of teams that could easily take Jermaine Johnson off the board before you pick, including Atlanta at number 8. And if that happens, okay, maybe you pivot to Ajabo. Maybe you pivot to one of the offensive linemen. Maybe you look at Sauce Gardner or Derek Stingley. I don't know. Maybe you trade down at that point and accumulate a whole bunch of picks. I don't know what the plan will be in that situation, but it might be that they're not there. But it's a great point, and it just sums everything up. And I think the best win the Seahawks have had in the last 3 seasons, Jeff, at least none others spring to mind ahead of this one, was the San Francisco road game in 2019. And why did the Seahawks win that game? Because they had a game-wrecking defensive line. A very inconsistent one, but one who won that game for them. And without him, they don't win that game.
It's funny. I was tweeting about this during the second round of the playoffs, and I said, and it's funny, Clint Hurt came out and said the same thing. And I know that was a giveaway to you. If you want to know what a game-wrecking defensive lineman looks like, put on the film of that San Francisco game, where the Seahawks were very inferior to that 49ers team. And the Seahawks beat them because Jadeveon Clowney ruined them. He completely ruined them. The Seahawks almost screwed that game up for other reasons because their roster wasn't that good. But Clowney hasn't had a game like that since, so it's not like you'd say just go sign Clowney and you can get that. He looked like Lawrence Taylor or Reggie White in that game. And really, he's never reached that performance again. That's what it looks like. That's what Jeffrey Simmons did to the Bengals in the playoffs. That's what Nick Bosa has done to the Seahawks. That's what Aaron Donald has done to the Seahawks. When you look at the Seahawks defense, since that turnover in 2017, who are the game-wrecking players? They've had Bobby Wagner. They've had Jamal Adams. Their best 2 players, probably other than Bobby, have been KJ Wright and Quandre Diggs, who are 2 very solid players. They are played at very high level, very sound. They would get very high grades on film, but those are not the guys who take over games. If you want to know what a game wrecker looks like, the Clowney film is a perfect example of what that we're talking about. And you just don't see that at linebacker and safety, which is why you were so irked by that. Probably what they were trying to do from Jamal was try to build that through another position because they couldn't get a defensive line. But Jamal has not played close to that in Seattle. That trade is just a joke right now. So you would have so much draft capital. Well, you've talked about that 200 times. But yeah, you need those guys, defensive linemen, which is why I thought that whole pass rush coverage debate a couple of years ago was total nonsense. You watch these defensive linemen, and they can we've seen what Aaron Donald's done to Russell Wilson, the Seahawks. They haven't beaten the Rams comfortably in years. And he's a 1 in a million guy. So you're not getting Aaron Donald, but just the game-wrecking defensive lineman, to me, is so valuable. And they're hard to get in free agency because, A, they don't really hit free agency usually. There's usually warts on the guys. Like Chandler Jones is on his 3rd contract. There are people that worry that he's a bad buy in free agency. Von Miller's a little older. The big-time defensive linemen don't hit free agency. So if the Seahawks line of thinking was, okay, we need to get into the top 10 because that's where these guys are drafted, then do it because they seem to have found a pretty good one, Darrell Taylor. I don't know if he's that blue-chip game wrecker, but I think he's a really, really good player. And if you compare him with that guy, that sets up an entirely different look for this defense moving forward. Now that the money has shifted out of linebacker and Jordan Brooks has shown pretty good signs. If you have those guys and if Jamal can actually pass rush in this new defensive scheme, this group is going to look a lot more fun defensively.
And I think what you could have with Taylor and let's say Jermaine Johnson is I don't think Cliff Averill and Michael Bennett were ever necessarily of the the Nick Bosa kind of level, but as a pair, they almost were worth the value of a great blue chip generational Myles Garrett type because they could you attack him from both ends, and that's the thing. I'm not sure that Jermaine Johnson's ever going to be viewed in the same light as Myles Garrett, but he with Taylor across from him could they could easily be known as a duo that go down as being a really effective tandem for the Seahawks. I think, Jeff, what you have to do, and I wonder what your view is on this, I still think whatever your intentions are, you probably have to sign a pass rusher next week. And I know that's not what was part of my plan, but you kind of need a hedge because what the worst thing that you could do is not sign a pass rusher next week at all, get to the draft, all the pass rushers come off the board early, and you miss out because then you're just left in the same situation that you've been for the last few years. You kind of need somebody in the building so that when the draft comes, the worst case scenario doesn't play out. And then if you have somebody, you can still take Jermaine Johnson, just have a fantastic rotation. It's just how much you spend and who that person is, because I suspect you don't sign Chandler Jones for $17.5 million a year, then maybe go and draft someone at number 9. But is there sort of like that next tier down? Is there somebody? I mean, maybe it is Hassan Reddick. I'm going to drag up the list here now to have a little look at some of the names. And look, I'll share the screen so that people can see this, and perhaps people can give their views and you give your view, Jeff, as to sort of what constitutes that. Okay, here we go. If you can see that.
Yep.
Who are the names on there that you could see being a potential hedge?
I see Melvin Ingram is a guy that would make a lot of sense to me. He's a little older. Harold Landry's off the board. He signed a massive extension last week, $18 million a year. So guys like Randy Gregory and Reddick, they're going to get a lot of money in this offseason. If I were Seattle, I would be looking more at the younger guys with a little more upside, maybe a Derek Barnett, a Nwosu from the Chargers. But if you want a pure hedge, if you think about some of the Seahawks hedges in the past, like when they drafted Bobby Wagner, they signed a linebacker. I think Barrett Ruud was his name from Tampa. Like an older guy was just supposed to be in there. So that could allow you to sign a Jason Pierre-Paul or a Melvin Ingram for guys who aren't going to cost like an exorbitant amount of money and would still allow you to draft Jermaine Johnson. If you pay a Reddick or you pay Randy Gregory or Chandler Jones, I think that's a tell that they don't think they're going to get the pass rusher they want. So to me, I think you go on the older side or you take a flyer on a young guy like a Derek Barnett who hasn't really lived up to his draft position other than that one play on Tom Brady in the Super Bowl. So there's a lot of names here. There's not a lot of top flight guys, which again, I mentioned earlier, there would have been a lot of stress if the Seahawks still had Russell, because if they didn't get one of those top 2 guys, I thought it would have become a very nerve-wracking fan base. But now, really anyone on this list sort of makes sense as either a hedge or a good enough replacement. But to me, if you listen to Clint Hurt, he talked about the need. They don't have that number 1 pass rusher. And you saw last year a pretty decent defense overall that didn't have the pass rush. It just left them too limited. So I like the idea of the draft because you can get these blue chip guys when here you're getting complimentary guys at best. And that's why I don't think a big name in free agency makes a lot of sense unless they're not thrilled about unless they're going quarterback and not.
The other thing I suppose you could say is that there is still names that could be added to this list. Frank Clark is expected to be cut. Zadarius Smith. There's a bit of talk about Daniil Hunter. I mean, I don't know what will happen there with him. He is due a big bonus later this month. But, I guess Frank Clark, for example, he's been linked with the Niners today. He is maybe an ideal hedge, really. It wouldn't be he's not a game wrecker, but if you started the season with him having missed out, then it wouldn't be the end of the world. So I suppose you could look at that. I just wonder, actually, it's not something I necessarily advocate here, Jeff. I've not really thought about this until we started talking about it, frankly. This kind of conversation has made this sort of put it in my head is whether or not someone like Randy Gregory, do you pay him for 1 year? And there's no commitment there. He's shown a lot. He's also had some issues. He's had some injuries. I don't think he's particularly reliable in either due to the injury or the off-field stuff. But you could possibly bring him in for a year on a decent salary for this year and have a good look at him. And he across from Daryl Taylor would be quite intriguing. And then if you bring in a Jermaine Johnson, well, you see how Gregory gets on and you make a call in 12 months' time. That could possibly be an option there.
Exactly. And that's where their flexibility with free agency is really valuable. Because if they're trying to in this win now mode or they're limiting their cap space, they can't do something like that. Now you can pay whatever $15 million on a 1-year contract for Randy Gregory, and it's not going to impact the rest of the things they're trying to do because they have a pretty much wide open roster right now, and you can take those swings. And if it hits, that's a home run move, and you can build your pass rush out of that. And if not, you're going to have a crap load of space next year, and you're not impacted either way. So, again, that would make a lot of sense. I think the issue from Gregory's side is I think given his past and his history, he's going to want to cash in and try to lock something down. So unless his market just tanks and he kind of slipped through the cracks and just wants a place he can rebuild his value, that might make sense. It's going to be hard to get him on that deal, but there's just opportunities out there now. A lot of these names could fit as either as a hedge or as a 1-year stopgap, or that's a good way to enhance the pass rush. Because you also have Carlos Dunlap as your third pass rusher too. And then you have him and Alton Robinson. That's a pretty good top four, and everything slides into place. But I just love the idea of having Dunlap and Jermaine Johnson as that pair. Because really, Dunlap should essentially be the hedge, right?
It's a good point.
Yeah.
Could be. I think with someone like Gregory, I don't know who trusts him, to give him a long contract. And then if it gets down to who's offering the most, if he's sort of like a hired hand, which he may end up becoming in his career, it does. Who's going to offer the most? That's when your sort of cap space maybe plays an advantage there. But we only have to wait kind of 24 hours to find out now. So that's the great thing. Less than 24 hours. Jason's got in touch. He says, I still feel that Averill is the most underappreciated Seahawk of all time. If he finishes the Super Bowl, we likely have 2 titles. Jason, thank you for that super chat. Just a few more things I want to talk to you about, Jeff, before we move on. Let's move that out of the way. I do want to talk to you. I mean, first of all, just a quick final point, by the way. When it gets to round 3, I would seriously consider adding a running back, because while we're talking about all of this, about building the defense up and emphasizing the O-line, I know that people are very allergic to sort of embracing the Pete Carroll way of playing football, but ultimately Pete Carroll is still the head coach. And I would sort of say, you've made your bed now. You've got to sleep in it. Pete Carroll's here. Russell Wilson is not. You might as well play Pete Carroll's brand of football. You might as well let him design this exactly how he wants. And even if they bring back Rashad Penny, I would still like to sort of invest in a young running back. And the great thing about young running backs is that you get value for sort of 3, 4, 5 years if they work, and you don't have to pay them. And then you should let them walk and get the next young, cheap running back who is talented coming in. And I think this is a draft where you can do that. And the name that, if people haven't been watching it and haven't been maybe listening to the streams, I still think that people like Georgia's Zamir White and Florida's Dameon Pierce are really good running backs for that. In particular, the more I've watched of Zamir White and the more I've listened to him speak and learn his backstory, I just think he is the guy. He has got the potential to, again, be another heart and soul player. And as we are looking for those types, the Jermaine Johnsons, the Nick Crosses, the Leo Chenals, the Channing Tindalls, the Zamir Whites, the Josh Pashals, these are people who I think can be building blocks in terms of your culture, not just what you see on the field. I do want to talk quickly about the quarterbacks, though, in the draft, because, this is the thing, and people are going to, I mean, I don't know, Jeff. I find the whole quarterback conversation very frustrating, I've got to be honest, because I get the sense that a lot of people have big opinions when they haven't spent any time really watching these guys.
That's common.
And with Malik Willis, you can run through some extreme positives with Malik Willis, and you can do the same for Corral and Pickett and Ridder. But unless you actually sort of sit there, and it's not even the TV copy, you have to be able to watch all 2022 to see how they're progressing, to see what's open downfield. You can't see that from the TV copy most of the time unless they show replays. You really have to dig in to this stuff to know what they're all about. And when you watch Malik Willis, I was saying to you on a DM earlier, the guy just refuses to throw over the middle. It's incredible. There are guys running downfield where there's not another player near them for 30 yards, and he's got his arm in the air, and he's practically turning around and waving at Willis, saying, throw him in the ball, and he still rejects it and sets off to try and run around. You have to sort of see the tape to sort of understand that's happening. With Pickett, there are little subtle things with Kenny Pickett that flare up, and there's a lot to like about Kenny Pickett as well, but there's also a lot where you just think that's wrong. I'm not blown away watching him. You watch Joe Burrow, there was nothing particularly physically brilliant about Joe Burrow, but watching him was an experience. You just thought, wow, this guy is really, really good. And when you watch Kenny Pickett, you go, yeah, he's okay. Yeah, he's pretty good. And with Corral there are issues, with Ridder there are issues, and this is kind of why I want to kind of move on to next year, because Will Levis, I've mentioned him twice and I said I wouldn't. To me, just excites. I just think, wow, that's a guy who could be, in the Josh Allen type range and without sort of the growing pains as well. But I do think you have to draft a quarterback, Jeff. I do think when you're in this position, you have to bring one in, and you've got to take shots, and you maybe take them a little bit later on in the draft if you're gonna do that, until you sort of make the big splash if you're going to do it. And I'd like to see them take Jack Cohen at Notre Dame. I'd like to see them take a chance. I don't think Jack Cohen's going to be a franchise quarterback. I don't think he is. I think he's someone that I'd just throw into the mix as a competition. I'd just say, go on, 4th round pick, 5th round pick, have a go. I think he's got a reasonable arm. I think he's suitably mobile. I think if people go and watch, here's what I would recommend people to go and do. Go and watch the Virginia Tech Notre Dame game from 2021. This is the point when Notre Dame were bringing in different quarterbacks. Okay, they're trying to find the future. Jack Cohen started the game and Notre Dame are winning. And they were going on quite well. And then they bring the other guy in. I can't remember his name. He wears number 12. They bring him in. He throws a pick 6. They keep him in the game. He throws another interception. Virginia Tech score again. All of a sudden, Notre Dame have gone from leading in the game to being 8 points down. They reintroduce Jack Cohen to the game. He immediately leads a touchdown drive and gets the 2-point conversion. They win in overtime. Now, I'm just saying that there are little moments when you watch a player and Jack Cohen sort of having them in position to win, letting the other guy essentially blow the game, and then bringing him back. There was 4 minutes left in the game, Jeff, when he took control of the offense again, down by 8, and they end up winning that game. Little things like that, to me, sort of say, I'll take this guy on day 3 and I'll give him a go. And if it doesn't work, who cares? And there's one other thing I would mention. The guy that he threw to more often than not, Kevin Austin Jr., is way better than anybody realizes.
Yeah.
And if we're talking about maybe the Seahawks need a wide receiver 3 or they should do it, if you told me that they took Kevin Austin on day 2 of the draft, I would not complain about that. That guy has got legit
He can fly
skills. He is very, very good. So a quick point on Kevin Austin there, but like I say, I am not for a second saying sometimes you can like a player without having too high expectations. I am not saying that Jack Cohen is going to be an NFL starting quarterback, but I think until you have the guy, you might as well take random shots on people, Jeff, to see if they can win a job, let's say. And if nothing else, maybe it can be a reliable backup for 4 years because they've not had that for a long time. I'm just saying that the more I've watched of him, there are things within his game that I think I'd give that a go.
And one of the goofiest parts of the John Schneider regime, and something I don't think he's got enough criticism for, but when he was hired, and he said this a lot early, is he talked about his building up with Ron Wolf. Ron Wolf's the guy who really put him in this business. Josh Schneider was like a high school, college running back. Like he wasn't a guy with a long history of football scouting. And he talked about this a lot, saying how he wanted to draft a quarterback every year and how it's important to just how Green Bay with Favre, they drafted Aaron Brooks and Mark Brunell, and they turned those into future assets. He's drafted 2 quarterbacks in 10 years. One of them was Alex Magoo, who's now in like the USFL. So he has not done this. And frankly, that's why they've been spending on backup quarterbacks, Geno Smith and Tavares Jackson and Boykin and all these guys, and they really haven't done it. And frankly, I don't think he gets knocked enough for that because it's really silly. They have him just doing this developmental thing right at all. Maybe that's what they view Drew Lock, but yeah. But I think overall what's happening, you're seeing it with the Seahawks now, and I think you're seeing it a lot in the league, is we talked about this a lot, and this happens commonly in the draft where the whole message all year was this is not a good quarterback class. This is not a good quarterback class. Now we're in draft mode. Now we're in draft season, and all of a sudden people are convincing themselves into these quarterbacks. And if you remember that, it's funny, we keep talking about 2011. That was the year where Blaine Gabbert, Christian Ponder, Jake Locker were guys who were not big prospects, and they were way overdrafted. Like those guys were drafted over J.J. Watt, and which seems crazy now. J.J. Watt's one of the best defensive players in the last 10 years. But this is what happens at draft time. You look at this draft class, and Matt Corral and Desmond Ridder and Malik Willis were talking about going to Pittsburgh at best. Now there's talk he might go number 2 overall to Detroit if Hutchinson goes first. So you're seeing a lot of rationalizing and a lot of people convincing themselves into these ideas. And the Seahawks might be doing that too, but this happens in the league. You see E.J. Manuel was picked like 13th overall in a bad quarterback class because someone convinced themselves that you can. These guys have traits. Malik Willis has traits. Desmond Ridder has some exciting traits. Matt Corral reminds me a lot of Andy Dalton as a prospect. It's funny enough, that's a guy the Seahawks almost drafted. So I like your idea. Take a shot in the middle of the draft. Take a flyer, but man, there's a lot of talk behind the scenes about Malik Willis. I don't know if that's a smokescreen. He does have some similarities to some of the guys they've liked in the past, but he might not even be a pick 9. Like there's talk he's going to go. Atlanta could take him. Matt Ryan's getting old. His cap hit. So we're just seeing it. Seahawks fans are starting to do it. I see a lot of Desmond Ridder talk. Like just take Desmond Ridder at 40. See what happens. I get that to an extent, but man, you're giving up. There's a huge opportunity cost there. You're giving up a potential. That range is supposed to be the strength of this draft. Like there's supposed to be depth across the board on all levels of the defense. To me, to take just a flyer on Desmond Ridder, who's got all these warts, and the opportunity cost is getting a defensive starter, to me, that's nuts. So I would much rather take a flyer in the later round, see what happens. You can go this year with Tyrod Taylor, Mariota, but yeah, John Schneider, start doing practice what you preach. Draft the guy in the 4th round, draft the guy in the 3rd round, see what happens, develop him. And if it doesn't work out, draft the guy in the 1st round next year. And it doesn't have to be a 1st round pick, but you're starting to see moves though. Like when you were talking, I don't know if you got a chance to see this, but we're starting to see some free agency stuff happen. Zach Ertz just re-signed. I don't know if you got a chance to see that. So Zach Ertz signed apparently a 3-year deal is going to make over $10 million a year. So good reason the Seahawks trade for a tight end on a rookie contract. Isaiah McKenzie re-signed. He was a guy I kind of liked. You mentioned a receiver that could do what he could do in the draft. And now there's talk Devin McCourty is going back to New England. So there's going to be a lot of people start to fill in here because, yeah, this is a really fun time of year. But quarterbacks, man, it's crazy. There is a lot of rationalizing. People are convincing themselves into these players. I'm seeing it so much, which is just – you talked about this 2 weeks ago with Seahawks fans, even a week ago. They would have said, don't trade Russell because there's no quarterbacks in this draft. Now it's like, they got to draft Malik Willis. So it's funny how that flipped in a week.
It's why I enjoy our conversations, though, Jeff, because I'd never even really thought of the 2011 comparison there until you brought it up. And then I look at the 2011 draft, and it's a fantastic point because, I mean, here are some of the names that went after Blaine Gabbert at number 10 and Christian Ponder at number 12. Well, for starters, Jake Locker was drafted at number 8. That was 1 spot ahead of Tyrone Smith. And Blaine Gabbert went 1 pick before J.J. Watt. And Christian Ponder went 2 picks before Robert Quinn. And then you look down the line, Cam Jordan was the 24th overall pick. Anthony Costanzo, he wasn't ever a spectacular left tackle, but he was a good starter for the Colts for a long time. And then you actually look at the top of round 2 and Andy Dalton at 35. I mean, why wouldn't you? Whatever you say about Andy Dalton, he was a better option to have in round 2. And then you take your Watts or your Smiths. And let's be right here, no one was. It's not like J.J. Watt was this, outsider, this unknown, or that Tyrone Smith was not known, or Robert Quinn wasn't known. These were the big names of the draft, essentially. And it was the Gabberts and the Ponders who got pushed up because of the quarterback need. I really wish we could just send the last 5 minutes of this stream to the Seahawks and go, just a reminder, guys, You don't have to take Malik Willis or Pickett or Corral or any of these guys. You can actually get some really good players that are in this draft. And my opinion is not going to change on that. Nothing is going to. I mean, I've studied. I mean, I will keep watching the games of the quarterbacks, and I will keep developing opinions, Jeff. But I've watched them all now, and my opinion won't change. There will never be any point between now and April that I bang the table for taking Malik Willis or Pickett or any of these guys at number 9. And I don't think I will bang the table for taking any of them at 41 or 42 or whenever the Seahawks are picking in round 2 either. And I think you wait till next year. You give yourselves a year, and I think you take a Jack Cohen at the end or a Caleb Ellaby, somebody like that, and you just throw them in there into the competition and you see how it goes. There's too much talent at other positions, and you need to build this roster. So let's see how that goes. I mean, there's 2 other final points I want to make, though, Jeff. First of all, if they go into week 1, provided they haven't done anything stupid, like give up a first-round pick for Kirk Cousins or trade the house for Deshaun Watson, if they do, even if they go into that week 1 with a Tyrod Taylor or a Drew Lock or whoever at quarterback, and the roster not looking like it's going to be anywhere close to contention, I have to say, the night before that first game, I'll be excited. I'll be looking forward to that first game just to see how this plays out. As a fan, I feel energized again at the prospect of a rebuild, much more so than I would have been with more of the same. I would have been perhaps even more energized if they kept Wilson, fired Carroll and Schneider, and gone in a completely different direction and built around him. But, but I'm also excited about a rebuild and seeing how this unfolds. The one thing I didn't want was the status quo and the run it back. And when there was all that talk of run it back amongst the fans and the media after the Arizona game, I was concerned. Now I'm excited. And the other thing, Jeff, isn't this just, I don't know how you feel about this. You might not care one jot. But isn't this the perfect time to, now that the Seahawks are embracing a new era, to change the uniforms to a modern throwback version of the throwback and have that be the look of the Seahawks for the next 10 years?
Yeah, like they switched jerseys in 2012. Russell Wilson, that whole era would be a great way to just step out of the Russell Wilson. I love that, like Joey Galloway era jersey. Like if they can come up with a modern version of that, signify the new era, that would be pretty cool. But to me, the funniest part would be as soon as Russell Wilson leaves and the Seahawks start spending an offensive lineman. That would be funny. But to me, what you said is right. Like, yeah, the ideal scenario probably, and on both of our minds, I imagine, for sure mine, would have been had they let go of Pete and John. That was what I would have thought the best direction for the team would have been in trying to build around the quarterback, because that would have re-inspired Russell again. And just reading all the tea leaves, that's why the trade happened. He did not believe in this leadership group anymore. If they brought in Nathaniel Hackett, say, they might still have Russell Wilson. They might be the one signing Chandler Jones this week. But that either way, again, I'm excited. Nothing is more fun as a football fan, obviously, when you're winning. But if you like the draft, like I know both me and Rob do, but one of the things that's just this whole regime has lost in me, they've ruined my favorite part of being a football fan, which is the draft and all the trade downs, and they haven't had high picks, and they get cute, and like we end up scratching our heads year after year, or they trade their picks away, they trade Jamal. And now all of a sudden I could get into the draft again. Now they went from having no first round pick to 3 picks in the top 41. And seeing those young players and how they turn out, the last couple of years of watching the Seahawks had just become very stressful, because it felt like they were wasting Russell. And it felt like every game was just a thing between Russ and Pete, and it was just a narrative. And I get angry texts from my other friends that are Seahawks fans. I couldn't even enjoy the games really anymore. And just the way Pete plays is very frustrating. It just became a really stressful thing where they should have been winning the game comfortably, and now that whole stress is like, I kind of get what you were talking about weeks ago, where Pete just seemed totally energized at the combine. And maybe the weight's off his shoulders too, because he could go and do what he loves, build a defense, run the ball, not have to worry about whether they're passing enough or whether they're doing that. I just want to watch a team and see it develop again. When we watched in 2011, there was no stress watching that team. And to see them turn into what they did by the end of the year, I don't know how many people remember that season, but they had bad quarterback play. But you could see something was being built there. And you could see by the end of the year, once everyone says, well, they went 7-9 and then the LOB, it's not really what happened. They didn't have Bobby yet, or Cliff, or Michael Bennett. In the second half of the year, Marshawn Lynch figured out something with the running scheme. And The defense started to form. Richard Sherman played like the 9th game of the year. And you could see just like a core of the team had been built and they had a style to them. And then they put in the quarterback, they put in Bobby, and the whole thing changed. But that's what I want to see this year about. Just changing them stylistically, enjoying watching a team play where you're not stressed if they're going to win or lose. You just want to see the young players get better. You want to see them come together. And that year we learned of guys like Cam Chancellor and Red Bryant and all these kind of guys. And it changed them for the good. And KJ Wright came that year. Richard Sherman developed and Doug Baldwin. That's what this year needs to be about. Just spike the roster with young players and make it fun to watch them again and not have to stress about if they're running too much and they draft a running back in the 3rd round, that's totally fine. If we have Drew Lock at quarterback, you can tell if you read my tweets, I think very little of Drew Lock, but if that's the plan this year, whatever, as long as they're doing something with the rest of their lines of scrimmage and making the draft important again and hitting on these top 10 picks and hitting on the early 2nd rounders, that hopefully D. Eskridge can be a player because we need to see guys like that start to emerge. And that will make this team fun again because the last couple of years just haven't been fun.
And a quick reminder to everybody that if you'd have said 3 years ago that the Cincinnati Bengals were going to be in the Super Bowl and that the Buffalo Bills were going to be in knocking in contention and that the Cleveland Browns would have even made the playoffs, you'd have said no chance. And a rebuild of the kind that we're talking about doesn't have to be a never-ending spiral of despair and mediocrity. You can create a fun, successful football team that achieves what the Seahawks have achieved for the last few years anyway, going this way, and you can even be a little bit better. The key to the difference really is between being a good football team and a great one is finding that quarterback eventually. But you don't have to do that in 1 year. That you can give yourself a couple of years or 3 years to find that guy and make the right move. And I hope that that's the Seahawks will take that approach. There's nothing better than feeling like your team is on the right track. And I just want the Seahawks to feel like they're on the right track again. They get it, that they're not kidding themselves about where they are or anything like that. So we will see what is going to happen. And I think it's going to be an interesting week because if nothing else, they're going to sign hedges for some of the positions that they're going to draft. And what I also would stress to fans is do not overreact. For example, if they spend a reasonable chunk on a quarterback, it doesn't mean they're not going to draft one. If they sign a pass rusher like Randy Gregory, like we've been talking, it doesn't mean they're not going to draft one. You know, often you don't want to go into the draft absolutely desperately needing anything. And it will be good for them to go into the draft actually with a relatively relaxed position, knowing that they can let the draft come to them. So bear that in mind as well. Right. Look forward to those new uniforms because they are going to be here next year as well, by the way. They are definitely going to have the throwbacks. I just think they should make them they should have like a modern twist on the old uniform and make that the key uniform. Before we go, I have to say, check out the blog this week. There are going to be not some minor changes. There is a huge storm of changes coming to the blog. I am talking, it's going to be unrecognizable after this week. So I'm not going to reveal anything yet, but it's the change is going to be as significant as what is happening with the Seahawks right now. So I'm not going to say any more than that, but stay tuned to the blog for that. Jeff, it's always a pleasure to speak to you. It's been fantastic and always learn something. So appreciate your time. Don't forget to like the video, share around the content, subscribe. Make sure you subscribe as well. And if anything big happens over the next few days, one way or the other, we're talking about it on this channel. So enjoy it. We'll see you soon. Bye for now.